Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead, and we have with us today Dr. Al Kertz. We're going to dig into the topic of calf starter and heifer protein. Before we get into today's session, a reminder that if you have any questions for Dr. Kertz, feel free to post those there in the chat area on your screen. If you're joining us from social media, you can post those questions directly in those channels. Now, Al is having a little technical difficulty with his camera, so we are going to be able to hear from Al today, but we're not going to be able to see Al. So, Al, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Well, on one hand, I can lament that my camera is not working, and on the other hand, not too long ago, last fall, I lamented in an article the demise of the calf starter, even though at the same time, we've had an upswing and a beneficial upswing on the milk replacer feeding program. Now, I'm familiar with the early weaning program. In fact, I wrote a review in 1979 about it. And so some people think I started it, I invented it. No, I didn't. It was started in the 1920s at Cornell University, and the idea was to minimize the amount of milk fed to calves so you could sell more. And that continued pretty much in vogue until about the year 2000, when further new studies at Cornell showed the benefit of feeding a higher protein milk replacer at a higher level and getting greater daily gains. So the old milk replacers had about 22% protein, 10 to 12% fat. And then as the fat came up, they dropped the protein to 20. The new accelerated milk replacers have 26 to 28% crude protein. Okay, and in the meantime, the calf starter situation, in the 1970s, it was pretty much a texturized starter at 16% protein as fed. On dry matter basis, that's about 18. Well, it's a little more difficult to formulate and make texturized starters and to handle them, especially depending on the amount of molasses in them and how thick it is or thin it is. So I think that's what led to an approach that said, well, let's put the starter all in a pellet. And once that began, it was got to be a little bit of a horsepower game, I would call it, where instead of a 16, they said, well, let's make an 18. And then somebody else says, well, mine's better than yours because I got a 20. And somebody else says, I got a 22. Somebody else said, I got a 25. So there were really no good data to support that increase in protein. And the main reason that the pellets have been used is because they cost less to formulate and to produce. But they're not always produced very well. What you see, that picture is of a starter I picked up at a place, and this was a texturized starter. But notice that there's quite a bit of fines, of smaller particles. So the pellet was not in very good shape. And this can happen in pelleted starters too. And the problem here is that calves do not like fines. They not only leave them, but they eat less of the total starter. So what I told the consultant to do, he had made a 22% protein texturized. I said, drop the 22 down to 20, put more wheat mids into the pellet, which you have room for now, and that'll make a better pellet, and their starter intake in the texturized form will increase. And that's what happened. So one of the problems with the higher proteins is that they cost more. In this case, I actually reduced the cost of the starter for him. Now, some might say, well, texturized high protein starters seem to have some benefit. Well, the benefit I could see that it might have is that when you have higher protein like that and it goes into the ruminant calf, the amino groups are deaminated. In the acid environment, an amino group will pick up 2 hydrogen ions and become ammonium. So what it does is it buffers the rumen. But you don't want to use a high protein to do that because that's very expensive. And then you're going to have greater nitrogen losses, which is going in the wrong direction. So that brings us to this review that I want to discuss today. some, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, I was contacted by a postdoc in Canada, Mortiza Goffrey, who was Iranian, and he had some questions about calves. So we got engaged in it. What I found was he was very bright. And what was unusual for sometimes bright people, he asked questions, he took input, and he made changes. He took good critique. So I've continued to work with him since. In this particular case, he was the lead author on this paper, along with Jim Drakely at the University of Illinois and myself. And what we did was we looked at this whole calf starter protein situation. So if we look at the first table, this was used the data from 2021 NASM, which was the successor to the 2001 dairy NRC. And what it did was Jim Drakely was on that committee, and he acted since 2001, young calf model was, which had more body composition and growth data. So the young calf model was made even much better. Now, because the older model depended on body composition of veal calves, which is not typical for herd replacements, it over predicted daily gains. So the newer model will be about 0.2 of a pound lower daily gain than the older model would predict. And in table 1, we see data from the newer model. And you notice that average daily gain on the left, the dry matter intake column, metabolizer energy column, crude protein amount, and then as a percent of dry matter intake. So if we go down the left-hand side, let's go between 1.32 to 1.98. So if you have a calf weighs about 90 pounds at birth, to double its birth weight in 2 months, which is the Dairy Calf and Heifer Association gold standard, at the end of 2 months, you would have to have about a 1.5 pound daily gain, between 1.32 to 1.98. And if we did that, the dry matter intake would need to be around 2. And if you go all the way to the right-hand column, crude protein percentage would need to be around 24. But now keep in mind, this table is strictly based on milk replacer. So it says you'd have to have about a 24% milk replacer if that's all you fed. Now, the good part about the young calf model is that you can put in the nutrient specs, protein and energy of a milk replacer. You can do the same thing for the starter, the amount being fed of each, the ambient temperature and the body weight, and it will tell you what the daily gain should be. If the daily gain is not at that point, then you need to look at your input, either your milk replacer input or your starter input, or the temperature or the body weight maybe isn't correct. So the new model in this 2021 does a much better job of predicting what the daily gains are. And if the daily gains aren't correct, then you need to look at your input and see what's wrong with that. So when we talk about starter intake, we have to talk about this interrelationship between the amount of milk or milk replacer fed and starter intake. It's an inverse relationship, and that's shown in the next figure. This is a meta-analysis done at Penn State. I think there were about 10 studies in it. And what it shows is that as you increase the liquid feed dry matter intake on the lower axis, that the starter dry matter intake decreases. And if you look at the slope of that line, it says that for every 100 grams more milk or milk replacer dry matter you feed, you get 60 grams less starter intake. Now that might not sound like much, but let's say you're feeding a half a pound more dry matter from milk or milk replacer, And in that case, you're going to lose over a 2-month period, 18 pounds of starter intake. Now that's significant. And it's going to be more significant right before weaning, the 2 weeks before and 2 weeks after. So that's a common problem that we have now, is that while we have the higher milk replacer feeding rates, which are good, they don't decrease enough for 2 or 3 weeks before weaning to allow enough starter intake for good rumen functional development. And so the calves can go into a slump after they've been weaned. Now let's take a look at table 2. The review paper also got into the whole area of heifer body weights, much better than the old table in 2001. I didn't find it was very reasonable on dry matter intakes and like. So this table, which I extracted from data, is based on predicted dry matter intakes. And so if those predicted dry matter intakes aren't correct, then the requirements may not be. But if we look at body weights, this is based on a mature body weight of about 1,500 pounds for a cow in a herd. So you see about 250 pounds, close to 500 pounds, close to 800 pounds, a little over 900, and 1232. So body weight as a percent of mature body weight will go from 16 all the way up to 80%. And the estimated dry matter intake you see increases, as it should and would under most conditions. But if those dry matter intakes are not correct, then the rest of the table won't be correct either, to the same degree that the dry matter intakes are off. The maintenance energy increases because you got greater body weight. The metabolizable protein also increases. If you look at the mature metabolizable energy for gain, they give you a range because that's going to vary depending on the daily gain and also on what the feeding program is. And then it calculates a minimum metabolizable protein and mature to metabolizable energy ratio. So you see that ratio actually decreases somewhat because as they get greater body weight, they need proportionally more energy to maintain body weight than they do protein. If you look at the energy concentration in the diet, you see that those numbers go up until about 500 pounds, and then they go down, except at the end they go up. And the reason they go up towards the end is because you have the additional energy requirement of pregnancy. Now, if you look at the crude protein as a percent of dry matter intake, you see that there's a range depending on daily gain. Starts out higher, it goes all the way down to 11.8, and then it's like 12.5 to 13.5 right before calving. However, I think those numbers may be too low because this is based on the requirement that calf and the heifer has for protein. What it doesn't take into account is as you get up about below 14% protein, you're going to lose digestibility of the total dry matter intake. So I would never go down much below 14% because while that may meet the requirement, it may also be a problem because you're going to lose dry matter digestibility, and so you're going to lose energy value. Now, if we look at the rest of that table, let's see. Actually, that is the rest of the table. The daily gains, of course, can vary from 1.5 to 2.6. And keep in mind, we want to be about 1.82. So we want to be in that mid-range because if you get above 2 pounds, particularly 2.2 pounds a kilogram of daily gain, then you're going to be on the verge of fattening. And there's several studies that show that similar thing in beef cattle. So we want to be careful about going above those daily gains of about 2.2 or more. So that's a summation of the study, of the report. It's got much more extensive information, such as on amino acids, and what we know now, what's lacking. I also had the lead author, when they cited other studies, I had him put in parentheses what the starter form was, physical form in the other studies, and what their daily gain was. Because what I find is a problem is that often a calf study is compared to other calf studies without references whether there was a different type of starter like pelleted or meal or well texturized, and what was the daily gains. If you don't look at those numbers, you're kind of comparing apples to oranges to bananas, and then you're sure in the same category, but you're wrong about how you can extrapolate that data. So the other thing is that, as I mentioned, when you do the heifer thing in a calf model as well, you need to be sure that the estimated dry matter intakes are right. If they're not right, then you could go to this table and adjust down, let's say the daily gains or the protein or energy contribution, because the dry matter intake was not as high. So that's kind of a summation of that study. I don't know if, Sarah, you want me to go into the bottom line?
Yeah, I'm going to ask you that, Al. Again, we can't see Al, but we can hear him. So, Al, what would you say is the bottom line in all of this?
Well, there's several things, and actually I took it from the summary in the study in the report in the Journal of Dairy Science. And one of the things is that it's important that we balance protein and energy. And if we don't, we might have enough protein but not enough energy, so we're not going to get the intake and the daily gain. The worst thing I've heard people say is, why do you have high protein starters? And they say, well, because the calves don't need enough starter. Well, then the problem is they're not getting enough energy. So increasing the protein isn't going to help them because they need more energy, more intake. Another point is that this ratio of protein to energy is something that we should take into account, and the table shows how that changes. As they grow, heifers grow, they have less need for protein relative to energy because they got a greater maintenance requirement for energy. But then towards the end of pregnancy, before they calve, that protein requirement goes up relative to energy. There are certainly areas that we don't understand as well as we like to be, like the protein and amino acid requirement. And the physical form of the starter is important. As we talked about, a well-texturized starter has the most beneficial effect on rumen functional development, intake before weaning and after weaning. And if you don't take that into account, it's very difficult to compare one study to another one because, like I said, it's comparing apples to oranges to bananas.
And we don't want to do that. That's not a good comparison.
No, we don't want to get in that area.
Exactly. Well, we want to thank you for joining us today, Al, and sharing your insight with us on this research. Likewise, we appreciate all of you tuning in as well. As always, all Feedstuffs 365 sessions are available at feedstuffs.com. Until next time, for Feedstuffs, I'm Sarah Muirhead.